very much Amit and Wadin and everybody for being here. There's a big debate in the environmental world whether to be an optimist or pessimist. Usually, the issues are so serious that we often are either pessimistic or we have to raise the alarm. On the other hand, if we're not somewhat optimistic, then we become immobilized. And I'm a little bit feeling both. Yesterday I was at the water conference in Tel Aviv, the International Water Conference, WATEC, and I heard from the Ministry of the Economy and the Ministry of Energy, and all I heard was Israel is taking care of everything, that 90% of the wastewater here is being recycled, that 80% of the water comes from desalinization, and that will be doubled in the coming 10 years, and essentially Israel is innovative in all of the environmental issues. And of course today, so far we hear about all of the problems and the balagan, and so I can't decide whether my head is spinning, whether to be an optimist or a pessimist. I'm not sure if it's spinning because of jet lag or because of the complexity of finding one spot. I tend to be in the middle, and as you'll see in my presentation, I think that there's really some things to be worried about with respect to governance. Obviously on the environmental issues themselves, they're all very serious, but with respect to governance, some things to be very pleased about and some things to be worried about. So what I'm going to talk about is what is federalism in the United States and how it applies to environmental law. Then I'm going to talk about the state, if you will, or the status of federalism in the context of the Trump administration, where everything is upside down, as you'll see. I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'll wrap up by applying some of the principles that we are experiencing in the United States to Israel, and really following on the fantastic presentation by Mickey and the panel we had before about what's happening in the cities, and I have my own few examples of municipal actions. So quickly. So federalism in the United States, of course, we have a national government, but that's not it. We also have 50 state governments. We have territorial governments. We have hundreds of tribal governments that are considered co-sovereign with the United States. And we have, of course, tens of thousands of municipal governments. And so the question is, how do we avoid confusion, and what is the interplay between all of those different conflicting and inconsistent approaches to environmental issues? The U.S. Constitution and the concept of federalism provides a little bit of a guide for us. So the Congress has certain powers specified within the U.S. Constitution. For example, Congress has the authority to regulate matters that affect interstate commerce between states within the United States. And the United States pollution statutes, going back to the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Superfund, et cetera, that you're all familiar with, all essentially derive their power from this constitutional concept of the ability to regulate interstate commerce. That's the majority of the conceptual underpinnings, constitutional underpinnings for the national environmental statutes. The states have all powers that are not given to the federal government reside naturally within the states. That was the essence of the U.S. Constitution. And so all of the states retain police powers to regulate the environment, as long as the states do not either unpermissibly burden interstate commerce. So it's not okay for Michigan to say we will not accept products from Ohio, for instance, because that would be impermissibly regulating interstate commerce. And so that's number one. And number two, it's not okay for the states to conflict with federal law. So if a federal law exists that establishes a particular principle, the state laws cannot be in conflict with that federal law. In addition to that, the states have the authority under most federal environmental law to implement and to enforce the federal law. There's a number of clauses within all of the environmental statutes. Because we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to read these or go into a lot of detail. The key point is that there are these provisions called savings provisions, which essentially means that the power of the states are explicitly saved or protected within the federal law within the federal environmental law, and it has different manifestations for different statutes. These are examples from the Clean Water Act and from CERCLA, which is the law to address contaminated sites, often referred to as Superfund. In addition, many of the environmental laws have a provision that says the states can establish their own standards, and as long as they're at least as stringent as the federal standard. And so this concept of environmental law is that the federal government creates the floor and not the ceiling. So the floor is established by federal standards, and the states are free, in not all cases, but in many cases, the states are free to provide additional standards that are more stringent than the federal standard. So here's an example, the Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act requires the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to establish what are called NAAQS, National Air Quality Standards for pollutants. Basically, this is just standards for contaminants. And then each state is required to develop a plan to implement a mechanism for achieving those standards, and that's called a state implementation plan. And then once that state implementation plan is approved by the EPA, both governments, both the federal and the state government, have the authority at that point to enforce the standards and the state plan. Other examples relate to site cleanups, contaminated sites. We've heard, and I talk to Amit all the time about the need for legislation in Israel for contaminated sites. In the United States, we have more, we can lend you some of ours. We have more than we need. We have both a federal standard called the Superfund, which designates the most polluted sites in the United States. There are about 1,300 of them. And the states participate in those cleanups as well. And then every state has its own authority to designate sites. And there are many, many, many more contaminated sites that are on the state list. For example, the last bullet, there are 60 sites on the national list that are within New York State, and there are thousands of sites that are on the state list in New York. So these are not as high a priority as the federal list, but still nonetheless requiring remediation. So, in theory, what we have is a theory of cooperative federalism, is that the federal and the state governments work together to create and enforce environmental laws and regulations. And as I said before, often the federal standards are viewed as the floor, not the ceiling, and that the states can impose more stringent standards in their states. And then the states monitor and implement and enforce many of the environmental laws. So that's the theory. But there are, nonetheless, the reality is that it gets very, very messy. For example, in areas where there are no federal standards, the states are on their own to develop their own policies, which will lead and does lead to inconsistent, sometimes conflicting policies across the country. And one thing, speaking not on behalf of any particular client, but just speaking generally as somebody who represents companies, I can tell you that companies, while oftentimes they don't like the particular rule or regulation that may be enforced against them in a particular instance, and may advocate for smart regulation, which has been disparaged a little bit today for good reason. Nonetheless, companies prefer, in many cases, to have a strong federal standard, a consistent standard that is asserted by the EPA, because then they know it's a level playing field, they know the rules, they don't have to meet one standard in New York and another standard in Mississippi. There's a uniformity and consistency across the country, which is, of course, more efficient and makes much more sense from an economic perspective. One current topic that's very hot in the United States, very, very important in Europe, and I believe is starting to emerge in Israel, is the issue of PFAS, perfluorinated compounds. There will be a movie with Anne Hathaway coming out I think next week called Dark Waters, which is a dramatization of the very, very severe issues associated with PFOA, one of these chemicals. These are perfluorinated compounds. There are over 5,000 of them. They have not been regulated by the EPA for really unfortunate reasons, a weak EPA. And as a result, because of a lot of media attention over the last decade or so, the states are under tremendous pressure to regulate these chemicals called PFAS. And we have standards, this is already an old map, conflicting standards, in many cases untethered to science, all across the country. And while it may have been convenient for a short while to not have the EPA assert itself, I think many companies now would say we'd rather have a federal standard where we know what it is and we think it's based on science. One problem with the state system, besides the conflicting standards, is that there are different degrees of competency within each state. And so you don't always have a high-level toxicologist or many toxicologists and scientists that you have at EPA, so that you can rest assured that the standards are based on science. Okay, so that's all we've talked about the theory. Now I'm going to talk about the concept. Now I'm going to talk. Now I'm going to refer to what's happening in the Trump administration. So the the environmental agenda for President Trump has resulted in a number of rollbacks and other dramatic changes, including dramatic budget cuts, both at the EPA and the Department of Interior, a massive reduction in civil penalties and criminal penalties, and I'll provide some examples, as well as rollback of environmental regulations. So this is a EPA, or rather the Trump administration's most recent proposed budget for 2020 would include a 31% reduction in EPA's budget, a 9% reduction in the Department of Interior, a 50% reduction in the budget for managing and protecting endangered species, a 95% reduction in an office called the Budget for Land and Water Conservation, which is responsible for implementing a lot of the protections at our national parks, and a 90% reduction in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is interesting because this is a fund that is very heavily supported by industry. This is dead on arrival. This is not going to happen, but Trump has proposed this for the last 3 years, but it's a sign of what he's trying to do. Environmental enforcement. Prosecutions are down 85% over the last 20 from the last 20 years. Penalties are the lowest since 1994, and many other factors in environmental enforcement, whereby essentially the administration is diverting resources to other priorities. And then on the regulatory rollback, whatever issue you can imagine, from mercury regulations to methane to climate change, the Trump administration is attempting, not really successfully, but attempting to roll back many of the pre-existing regulations, some of which were Republican initiatives as well. So it's bipartisan in the sense of opposing all environmental regulations wherever they come from, although of course he has a particular disdain for the Obama era. These are just some of the examples. The New York Times reported 85 different rollbacks of environmental regulations that the Trump administration is advancing. And so what's happening? There's a huge backlash from the states, and this is where we get into the cooperative federalism. In 2018, Democrats picked up 7 governorships to bring the total to 23. Democrats have now gained control of both the governorship and the legislative bodies in Colorado, New Mexico, Illinois, Connecticut, Maine, Nevada, and New York, and as of 2 weeks ago, Virginia. And there's a huge effort in these states and other states to essentially fill the void left by the Trump rollbacks. I'm going to skip ahead. This is a very important one. There is an organization called the U.S. Climate Alliance. It's an alliance of 24 states plus Puerto Rico. It's bipartisan. It includes Republican and Democratic states. It represents 55% of the U.S. population, and here's an amazing fact. By itself, it would be the 3rd largest economy in the world, behind the United States and China. And this Climate Alliance has said, we don't care what the federal government is doing, we are going to comply with the Paris Accord. And that's just the beginning. There's efforts as well to go beyond Paris by this organization. Each state is committed to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025, as well as many other commitments. National fuel standards is another example where there's an effort by the federal government to roll back fuel standards, fuel economy standards for automobiles, as well as emission standards for automobiles. California has a congressionally allowed opportunity to get a waiver from the federal standards, and so has tried to assert its more stringent standards for automobiles. The Trump administration has attempted to revoke California's waiver, in other words, revoke its authority to have its own limits, and California has now sued the United States. This is very important because if you're an auto manufacturer, you're going to comply with California, the most stringent standard. You're not going to have two automobiles, and so if California is successful, they will essentially create the national standard. And there are many, many other local and state initiatives that you can see examples of on this slide from all 50 states and thousands of cities, similar to the discussion we were having a minute ago. There's also extensive litigation. There's a suite of about a dozen public nuisance lawsuits against oil companies by cities and states across the country, essentially alleging contribution to climate change from oil and gas. So in conclusion on this piece, and then we're going to pivot in my remaining time to Israel. So even in the best of times, cooperative federalism creates a messy and uneasy coexistence between the federal, the state, the territorial. Territorial, by the way, is entities like Puerto Rico that are not states, counties, municipalities, etc. Many states and municipalities, especially now, but also even before, view themselves as a backstop against weak or misguided federal environmental policy making. And while the void is, and this is where we kind of navigate this tension between optimism and pessimism, while the void is being filled in part by state and municipal initiatives, it really does lead to inconsistent and a mishmash, if you will, it's a technical word, of environmental policies across the country. So cooperative federalism in Israel, now of course I come to you, I know that Israel is not a federalist system, but there are analogies. And that's what I want to speak about, and a lot of this we've been talking about already. Within the Ministry of Environmental Protection, there is a whole topic, and this may again be more theory than in actuality. We'll hear from the ministry, but there's an entire webpage on the ministry's website devoted to empowering municipalities and town authorities. These are just a couple of quotes. The Ministry of Environmental Protection supports and cooperates with environmental units, the local authority. Within these local authorities, the units are responsible for bringing to fruition the ministry's policies at a local level. The last quote is interesting. Given the importance the ministry attaches to the role of environmental units in preserving the environment, and given the ministry's goal of expanding deployment of environmental units, we are working to expand the powers of the units. Now, this is not the constitutional federalism. It's not quite as hefty as what I was describing before, but it is an articulation of an interest at the national level to empower the municipal level. And the Ministry of Environmental Protection also identifies specific areas where the local units are empowered and should be acting, including air monitoring, regulation of industries, environmental planning, noise, etc. They even have on their page several, on their website, contact information for the local authorities. That's the good news. The bad news is it's 2015, so it hasn't been updated. So one can ask the question, how devoted truly is the Ministry of Environmental Protection to local authority? But nonetheless, there is language there that we can turn to. So a few examples. Some of these have already been discussed in the prior panel, but I did want to share some that I thought were interesting. There is an organization called C4 Cities, which is designed to promote a circular economy. A circular economy is essentially the ability, the imperative to reuse resources to the greatest extent possible. In a recent report last year, the C40 document celebrated 40 case studies from around the world and picked as one of them Tel Aviv. So they talked about areas where Tel Aviv is advanced in terms of planning for a circular economy, including dealing with textile waste, construction and demolition, innovation and acceleration of technologies, water management, etc. So, there's a little bit of good news there. Also, if you look at the Tel Aviv-Yaffa strategic plan from 2017, again, there's a disconnect between the intent, maybe, and the delivery, but nonetheless, there's clearly an effort and a recognition that Tel Aviv needs to become a sustainable and cutting-edge city with respect to transportation and natural resources. And Tel Aviv articulates a number of policy goals, including good urban environmental protection, and developing a balance between urban development and ecosystem resilience. And then other activities, which I know you're all very familiar with in Tel Aviv, including the banning of plastic, and of course the expected construction of the mass transit system by 2021. For the next Adam Teva Units Conference, we'll be all getting here by public transportation. Other municipal initiatives in Eilat and Herzliya are both in the process of drafting a prohibition on single-use plastics. The Galil Elyon Regional Council recently adopted a similar prohibition. There's efforts across the country and a number of different other examples. In Nahariya, after many, many years of having a terrible record with respect to cutting down trees, Nahariya has now adopted a policy of protecting trees. There's pesticide regulation in many municipalities across the country, starting with Farsaba. We talked earlier today about the Coastal Municipalities Forum, headed by the mayor of Herzliya and involving 23 coastal municipalities to promote the implementation of the Coastal Zone Management Law. Recycling of construction waste is a growing trend across the country. I think Modin was the first to require separation of construction waste, thereby saving landfill space for proper waste. And then rainwater collection, starting in Misgav and other places now. Misgav requires schools to collect rainwater for use in the bathrooms and for gardens, reducing by 80% the need to purchase water. And then, of course, numerous lawsuits which Adam Teva Wadin is often leading, including the Hadera Airport petition, where the Hadera and the National Regional Council petitioned the High Court against the decision to open an airport in East Hadera. Again, another example of local initiative. And also, of course, the Herzliya petition, where Adam Teva Wadin and Herzliya have recently filed a petition requesting a second hearing before the Supreme Court with respect to construction of the Apollonia contaminated parcel. And then here's some breaking news. Last week, Ashdod was named this year's recipient of the United Nations Istanbul Environmental Friendly City Award. I'm happy to announce, in case you weren't aware of that. I'm not sure why it's named the Istanbul Environmental Friendly City Award. Because they paid for it, okay. So in any event, I think it's interesting on many levels, geopolitical as well as environmental, that Ashdod was recognized only the second city to obtain this award. So, in my remaining negative 2 minutes, I have one last slide. So, while we all acknowledge that Israel is not a federalist system, as we've seen, there are many opportunities for local and regional authorities to play a very important role that is similar, at least analogous, of course not identical, to the role that states play in setting environmental policy in the United States. And of course, as we would expect, this is particularly true with regard to zoning issues, contaminated sites, and permitting. However, as we've discussed, there are many examples where municipalities in Israel have taken the initiative to promote broader climate change policies and sustainability policies. In both the United States and in Israel, relying upon local authorities and, for environmental policy setting has advantages and disadvantages. The main advantage is we need to act and we need to set policies where there's a void at the national level. The disadvantage, of course, is that it creates inconsistency, and oftentimes it's subject to political pressure, even more political local pressure. In the words of the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who, as you may know, was the first Jewish United States Supreme Court Justice. He talked about federalism a lot, and one advantage that he said for federalism is that state power provides an opportunity for citizens to create what he called laboratories of democracy in order to experiment with novel social and economic policies. And perhaps we should add to that list environmental policies as well. Thank you very much.